I am very pleased to welcome back for the first time in many, many years, Dr. Steve Best, who told me that in the interest of time I could forego my biography for him, which was a little bit out of date anyway, and simply say that he's an animal rights advocate, author, and professor of philosophy at the University of Texas, and he has a forthcoming book coming out, which is Total Liberation, Revolution for the 21st Century. Let's hear it, everyone, for Dr. Steve Best.
Thanks. It's great to be back to this forum after a long time. I've been asked to talk about the history and philosophy of animal rights, so I'll do that, and please, I don't want to be too contentious. But the philosophy and the history of animal rights has been formulated in opposition to the philosophy and history of animal welfareism. So I'll say a few things about that and try to underscore what I think is the real significance of our movement. Views of animal welfare actually can be traced back as far as the Old Testament. We find emphases there of treating animals kindly and not unnecessarily abusing them or causing them pain without some sufficient reason. That's very different from the logic nature of animal rights, as I'll try to show. Both welfareism, however, in its utilitarian context, I'll describe, and rights have emerged in a modern context, the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, that is very much bound up with capitalist societies. So when we look at modern welfareism, animal welfareism, we see it's associated with the theories of utilitarianism, which have been developed in the 18th and 19th century by thinkers such as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Of course, the emphasis of utilitarianism comes out of capitalism, capitalist society, because it emphasized the primary values were pleasure, happiness, and some kind of utility seeking, which is what the economists and revolutionaries of capitalist society were doing, perhaps in some vulgar way, but that's what they were doing. Utilitarianism, of course, says that the right action is the action that brings the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. Now, that's a very self-evident and satisfying philosophy, right? Because it seems to benefit the majority. In fact, that philosophy, although it came out of capitalist society, was very subversive of capitalist society. Because if put into practice, we're really talking more about a socialist kind of ideology in society than capitalism, right? Because capitalism is based upon a minority of a class domination over the majority of people. So in fact, if this utilitarianism were put into play socially, economically, and politically, we would have a situation where the 99% are dominating society instead of the 1%, which is what we have now. So in terms of animal moral status, utilitarianism was also a very satisfying doctrine because it shifted the whole ballgame all the way from Aristotle to Descartes and Kant. Every damn philosopher and major thinker in Western society said animals can't have rights because they don't have reason. And everything turned on this concept that animals don't have reason, although we have always overestimated our rationality and underestimated the rationality or intelligence of animals, haven't we? Yeah. What an irony. We're not that intelligent of a species. We're destroying our own world. So what utilitarianism did was says, no, it's not rationality that's important, it's sentience, the ability to feel. And then you have moral interest. So of course, as Jeremy Bentham put it, the question is not, can they think? Can animals think? The question is not, can they reason? The question is, can they feel? We know the answer to that. God damn it, we know the answer to that in every film we see and every banal or marvelous experience we have with animals. We know the answer to that question. But utilitarianism became anchored to animal welfareism in a somewhat conservative way. Because although it endowed animals with a moral status, this moral status was something that could be traded away for utility, for a greater gain. Oh, well, if humans can exploit animals and we can get a greater gain or benefit out of it, then so be it. Just don't punish them, hurt them unnecessarily. If you have to, sacrifice their interest toward ours. If you have to, sacrifice their interest to a greater interest, the human interest. And so it was done. And so it was done historically and always throughout history. And utilitarianism and its welfarist implications became the dominant way of assigning animals moral status until animal rights emerged late in the 20th century, in the 1980s and thereon. Now, rights discourse, too, comes out of capitalist society. It comes out of natural law philosophy from thinkers such as John Locke. It comes out of the American and French revolutions. This discourse did not exist before the American and French revolutions in that era. Rights emerged in a capitalist context that assigned individuals the liberties to pursue their freedoms and their visions of the good life as they saw fit. Fundamentally, these liberties were economic, because this was a capitalist movement. And fundamentally, rights were property rights, the right to accumulate capital and land and power as one could in a competitive social relationship. That's what rights was all about. But rights had another face to it, a subversive logic, an important logic that we're all clinging to today. Because rights also had not just an economic development, laissez-faire, competitive capitalism. Rights also had a profound legal, political, and moral status, in that it guaranteed basic liberties and basic freedoms, not just to exploit, but to speak and to live a life free of exploitation, certainly at least in theory. Now, Marx said that capitalism creates its own gravediggers. A capitalist society creating a mass industrial labor force creates its own gravediggers. It, like Frankenstein, creates powers that it cannot control. Well, that's what happened with rights. Because capitalists created economic rights and dressed them up in political, moral, and legal rights. But these political, moral, and legal rights proved to be very subversive. They proved to be the gravediggers of this system to a certain extent, right? Because the exploited used rights in their own interest. Labor and other elements of the population that were exploited began to use rights as their own moral coinage to protect their own interests and their own freedoms, their freedom from exploitation. So what happened with rights, it was a very subversive logic. It began to spread and spread and spread away from just a white economic elite toward all sectors of a disadvantaged and oppressed and exploited society, to include gender, to include sexual identity, to include ability, to include virtually every marginalized social class could use this language of rights to appropriate their own freedoms against the exploiters and the expropriators in capitalist society. And so soon it would just be a matter of logic and time when people began demanding rights for animals. In fact, the very era, the very moment that rights began to appear in a human context, you already see people speaking of animal rights. And I'm talking about the 17th, 18th century. You can see reference to animal rights. Not just welfare, but animal rights. But it was through welfarism that this movement would eventually advance. And it was through welfarism that a lot of important things happened through animals. And this developed further, of course, in animal rights. Now, in their logic, moral rights, animal rights are the following. One, they are egalitarian. They establish intrinsic value for all beings who have value. Suffering is suffering. Captivity is captivity, and exploitation is exploitation for the animal rights movement. building on this idea that human beings are fundamentally equal. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and we just have to extend that to the next step and say that animals are also the same equality, and in fact use utilitarianism to do this. Notice how these two logics, these two philosophies that have been so counterposed in modern history, such as between Mill and Kant, if you know that reference, these come together really in the context of rights for animal rights. We're no longer talking about, with animal rights, responsibilities to animals, being kind to animals. We're talking about the rights of animals. Not our responsibilities to animals, the rights of animals. So we're not talking about kindness anymore. We're talking about justice. These are two very different. Kindness, absolutely. But it has a kind of condescending quality to it. When we realize that animals are equals, that we are animals, then we recognize that these are our brothers and sisters, our brethren in the evolutionary world. They are not to be considered in any other way. Moral rights are not just egalitarian, they are abolitionist. So when they demand not the regulation of exploitation, but the elimination of exploitation. Not regulation, elimination. And rights also are inalienable. Inalienable. They cannot be traded away. They cannot be bargained for. You cannot say, well, you can have some of this being's interest can be sacrificed for another being's interest if it brings a greater utility. No. And even if it does bring a great utility, and this is the argument for vivisection, right? We need vivisection for so-called medical progress. No! Even if it does bring an alleged great utility, it's still wrong. It's still wrong and wrong. There's no evidence of vivisection. That's what rights do. Rights give beings interests that are inalienable. They cannot be traded away or bargained for. Animal rights is rooted in an analogical argument. It says that if humans have rights, animals have rights for the very same purposes because of shared characteristics. It says that if racism and sexism are wrong, then speciesism also is wrong. And let's be logical about this. The quick counter-argument to this position is that, well, there are fundamental differences between humans and animals, or between human and non-human animals. There are fundamental differences, and of course, people of color and women have the same rights as white elites. Of course they do, but with animals, we're really talking about differences in kind and not just in degree. We're talking about something qualitative and fundamentally different. Well, no, we're not. No, we're not, because really the basic moral touchstone for any theory of value has to be sentience and not alleged irrationality. No, we're not, because notice that the logic of equality is also a logic of difference. Look at all the people in this room tonight. We have people of different ages. We have people of different genders, of course, and we have, to some degree, people of different ethnicities or races. And does that mean that because there are differences, we're not all the same? We don't have the same moral innate intrinsic value? Well, no. And I hear we have some dogs in the room, too. I haven't heard any cats speak up, but I've heard some barks. And imagine if we had giraffes or elephants in the room, okay? Does that mean that suddenly the moral picture of this room has changed? No. We all have fundamental interests. We all feel pain. We all have desires and pleasures in life that we want to be satisfied and that should be respected. And so there is, of course, difference, but these differences are not morally relevant. Factual differences amongst people between human and non-human animals, but they're not morally relevant. So the logic of equality really is a logic of difference as well. If we eliminate all of the bogus arguments that are used to buttress human supremacy, we come down to this. That rights are legal and moral constructs to protect any being that has interest. If you have an interest in living well rather than living hell, if you have an interest in that, and you have a right to protect it according to any decent, moral, philosophical, or legal argument. rights really have nothing to do, despite all the philosophical bullshit over thousands of years. Rights really have nothing to do with culture, alleged culture, language, alleged language, and reason, alleged reason. Rights have fundamentally to do with interest and sentience. And that's where we draw the line. The line now is to be drawn between sentient and non-sentient life, between subjects and objects, and not between human and non-human animals anymore. Rights have a two-sided nature. They protect the liberties and interests of the rights bearer, and they also impose obligations or restrictions on others not to harm the rights bearer. You know, animal exploiters always complain about us, don't they? They say that we seek to take away their freedom. They are entirely correct. We do seek to take away their freedom to exploit animals. We do seek to abolish fur farms. We do seek to abolish circuses. We do seek to abolish rodeos. We do seek to abolish vivisection. We do seek to abolish the meat, dairy, egg industry. And right, we're here to take away your freedoms, your alleged freedoms that you should never have in an immoral society or civilization. Damn right, we're here to take them away. And that's why they want to take us away. Because we're here to take that away. The modern slavery economy that generates billions of dollars for exploiters on a sea of blood and misery and suffering. And we're here to stop it, and stop it altogether. Now, if animals have rights, what rights do they have? They have wings, they have the right to fly. They have legs, they have the right to run. They have fins, they have the right to swim. They have the right to live their own lives as they choose. They have the right to be with their families and relationships and in a natural environment that is not degraded and poisoned. They have the right to enjoy their lives, the right to self-determination. The right to self-determination and the right from exploitation from predatory, bloody human hands. So as I said, we found the concept of rights in history very early on, with the movement developed through the path of animal welfarism. And that's fine, it's an evolutionary movement. This certainly began in 1975 in a very salient way with Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation. I don't know about you, but that was one of the first books I read around 1985, and that blew my mind. That changed my maps and changed my categories at that point, right? Written by a philosopher, and by the way, philosophers have had a leading influence on this movement as opposed to other social movements, like to put in an ad for philosophy. So Peter Singer's book was brilliant in its empirical description of animal exploitation, and it also provided some very strong moral argumentation for the moral status of animals. But it didn't provide enough moral protection for animals, because their interests can still be traded away. And that's obvious if you look at Singer's positions on vivisection. He will sometimes say that vivisection cannot be legitimated in any sense because it harms so many millions or billions of animals as opposed to some theoretical number of humans with some theoretical kind of interest. But he will also say that in a certain context, if the utility, right, we're back to utilitarianism, if the utility can be measured, how do you do that? According to the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of not people but beings, then it can be justified. So Singer has a weak position on that, and it's not strong enough. It doesn't give animals strong enough protection for their fundamental interests. And that's what Tom Reagan said about them in 1983, his book, A Case for Animal Rights. This was a philosophical landmark for this movement. I don't know if anybody here can say they've read the whole book, but it's well worth reading, and it's a dense philosophical argument indeed. But Reagan tried to put rights on the map with fundamental abolitionist consequences, and he insisted that he was an abolitionist, not trying to regulate, but trying to eliminate all industries of exploitation. And in many ways, this was very radical. Well, what happened with the mainstream animal rights movement in the 1980s and 1990s is it became a bit regulated, It became a bit, if you will, co-opted and working hand in hand with other industries. But this is what Gary Francione said about the change. With his critique of new welfarism, not just welfarism, but new welfarism, where welfarists are suddenly people who talk about the language of rights, and I think we all agree the language of rights, I know I'm running short, but who also will try to use reformist policies to reach those rights. Okay? I'm not here to judge on that issue because that's very complicated. Arguments can be made on both sides, but that was Francione's argument. And so Francione claims himself to be an abolitionist, to reinforce abolitionism. But he really, if we're talking about co-optation, his own abolitionism was co-opted because it is linked to very private, subjectivist consumer policies of veganism. We're not political out in the streets anymore. Okay? We're not doing civil disobedience like Martin Luther King did in the 1960s. No, we're in our homes enjoying these great vegan meals, and that's fine. But the politics of this has been evacuated from this movement and it needs to be restored. So when we talk about abolitionism, do you know about the 19th century movement in the U.S. to abolish slavery? Do you know? Have you read about it? Do you know what they did? Among other things, it was very pluralistic. It used all kinds of tactics across all kinds of people, including, yes, violent tactics. And it also sought to bridge alliances amongst different kinds of groups. And it also was very militant in various ways. We have lost, if we call this abolitionism, we have lost all of what we had in the 19th century U.S. here. How dare we call this abolitionism? It is, if you will, pardon the metaphor, declawed, defanged form of abolitionism. All right, I want to make some concluding remarks. I know we're running long here. Animal rights is a key marker of moral progress in the modern world. If we look at what has happened with the development of rights, we see a coherent trajectory reaching out through Western society. The rights are expanding, moral sensibilities are expanding, human consciousness is expanding. We are representatives of that right here, right now. Animal liberation builds on classic humanist values such as rights, justice, democracy, liberty, community, etc. It builds on that, takes them to their next logical conclusions. Some theorists say that this movement cheapens the notion of rights. I'm sorry, it does not cheapen the notion of rights. It redeems the notion of rights from arbitrary speciesist conclusions and logic. So let's be clear. Let's be real clear here. We are fighting not for reforms, but for a revolution. For the end of slavery, not humane slave masters. For a new consciousness, not benevolent slavery or enlightened humanism. Animal liberation advances the most radical idea to ever land on human ears. Animals are not ours to exploit, not for food, not for clothing, not for resources, not for data, not for commodities, not for entertainment. They exist for their purposes and not ours. Animal liberation is an assault on arrogant speciesist mentalities. It demands that we relinquish our sense of superiority over non-humans and smashes the compasses of anthropocentrism and speciesism. It provokes people to realize that power demands responsibility and that might is not right. It poses a fundamental evolutionary challenge to human beings in the midst of severe social and ecological crisis. Can we grasp how the exploitation of non-human animals is implicated in every aspect of social, mental, and ecological breakdown in our society? Animal rights is a touchstone for measuring the degree to which we are sane and healthy. It is a measure, a barometer, that can tell us whether we as a species are going to survive or not. Animal liberation is the most difficult battle that humans have ever fought for because it requires widespread agreement to abandon the privileges of power and and what people perceive to be their God-given right to exploit other species. To change these attitudes and the systems that they inform is to change the very nerve centers of human consciousness. But that is our task, and no more and no less. Thank you.
Whoa. Unbelievable. I didn't know we were getting a keynote here. That was unbelievable. That was a little over my head at times, but I think you blew my mind too.